Welcome, everyone, to the Week 16 edition of the Waiver Wire Show presented by the 33rd Team. I'm your host, as always, Josh Larky, joined with me, as always, by my co-host, the Associate Director of Fantasy and Betting, Ryan Reynolds. We are going to go over a few top ads for Week 16 waivers. We don't need to keep this section too long. If you are in the fantasy football semifinals, you want good players, we are only going to talk about some of the good players that might be available on waivers. Then we'll hit on a few fantasy start sit decisions that are going to impact those of you trying to get into Week 17, the fantasy championship. I've got a couple questions for Ryan on general strategy for fantasy football at this time of the year. And then we're going to hit on quarterback streamers, tight end streamers, and end with defense special team streamers. Ryan, I think we can do this in 30 minutes. Let's dive right into Ty Chandler. He's rostered in 53% of leagues, which means there's a slight chance he's not rostered in your league. But hey, if he's out there, you need to scoop him up. The Lions this week aren't a great matchup, but the usage, I think it's just too good not to start. Ty Chandler had 23 carries to Kene Nwangwu's 1, and he ran 17 routes to Nwangwu's 3 routes. Chandler had essentially 23 of 24 running back carries and all 4 running back targets. He turned it into 157 total yards on those 27 opportunities for 25 fantasy points. He's undersized, but it's clear that the team is willing to give him all of the work. I don't think Madison returns this week. He has a high ankle sprain. Ryan, what did you see on film from Chandler? Did he look as good as the stats showed for this past week?
Yeah, I mean, he's been a talented player all year. It's just I think you'd agree with this. The usage spike last week was not only encouraging, but it was a little bit surprising. So I don't want to bank on that being the full-blown reality, especially since last week was, I frame that as the first game all year that the Vikings had a balanced offense, from a play calling standpoint. So I don't want to treat that as the new reality. However, they're going to probably have to score against the Lions. I'm very excited for him as a check down option with Nick Mullins in that contest potentially, but I'm a little bit leery on just like plugging him and playing him, but if he's available, you got to go get him, even just to block an opponent.
Noah Brown, Texans receiver, only 41% rostered in Yahoo leagues. Last week, he had 11 targets. That's a 32% target share. He caught 8 of those 11 targets for 82 yards and a touchdown, 22 PPR fantasy points against the Titans last week. That's exciting. Even if Nico Collins and his calf strain return this week, I'd still have interest in starting Noah Brown because he gets CJ Stroud back from the concussion protocol this week. The Browns are not a good matchup, but I think the Texans offense with CJ Stroud is just one that you don't really want to bet against. And Noah Brown has this pretty incredible slot role locked down. Do you have faith that he can overcome the Browns defense this week?
Yeah, I mean, the slot role is the key thing to me. Their perimeter quarters are excellent, Newsome and Ward in Cleveland. So any perimeter receiver against Cleveland, I'm going to down tick them. But yeah, I mean, with Stroud, like you said, this is a big game too for both teams. So Browns usage has been great, even if Nico Collins returns. And then looking forward to Week 17, we definitely want Brown for the Titans. That's why I'd be super aggressive again with him, because you don't want to face anyone on the Texans passing attack next week either.
That's a good point. 22 fantasy points against the Titans without CJ Stroud. He will have CJ Stroud against the Titans week 17. Zamir White, Raiders running back. We don't know if Josh Jacobs is playing this week, but if you need a running back, Zamir White is only 16% rostered across Yahoo leagues. The Chiefs allow 4.7 yards per carry to running backs. That's the second highest mark. Zamir White had 17 carries. Amir Abdullah only had 6. The more encouraging split was that Zamir White ran far more routes than Abdullah, and he had 4 targets to Abdullah's 2. Zamir White was essentially just thrust right into the Josh Jacobs role. He finished with 17.5 fantasy points against the Chargers. Chiefs are a tougher matchup overall, just given game script and whatnot, but you'll be hard-pressed to find a guy that's going to get you 20 touches on the waiver wire, and Zamir White is available in nearly every format.
That's exactly how I see it, Josh. With Ty Chandler, he's the priority here between the two of them because he's a more explosive player. But, and plus he's going to play most likely, where with White, that's more in question. But again, like you said, if you're in dire straits at running back 2 or flex, you have to go all in on White if you don't get Chandler.
Guys, that's Ryan Reynolds, NFL on Twitter. For those watching the live stream on Twitter and YouTube, welcome. Ryan's Gold Shades. They don't pay for themselves. If you want to help support Ryan, you should read his work on the33rdteam.com. He has his Survivor thoughts on Mondays. His NFL power rankings drop today on the site Tuesday. Thursday, his expert picks and predictions for every game come out. And on Saturdays, he lets you know what he's betting on in each and every game. All right, Ryan, it's time to get a little more pessimistic. We have to mention some other waiver ads we are less excited about. Trey Sermon, Colts running back. He is rostered in 0% of leagues. Zach Moss hurt the same sided shoulder that he had the broken arm from earlier this preseason. That's concerning. Zach Moss has said he wants to play. I am very skeptical. Trey Sermon in relief of Moss, since Moss left the game after only 4 carries. Sermon had 17 carries for 88 yards. Tyler Goodson came up from the practice squad. He had 11 carries for 69 yards. Ultimately, Sermon ran more routes than Goodson. Goodson actually had more red zone carries, but I think that was just some drive alternating. Ultimately, Sermon's got about 25 pounds on the undersized Tyler Goodson. I would just leave Goodson on waivers, and if you just have to have a desperation start, I think Sermon's going to get you 15 to 20 carries. It's not going to be particularly exciting. He probably won't be efficient, but volume is volume, and he's literally available everywhere.
Question for you, Josh. Was it Tony Jones last year that played without context and literally played an NFL game as a running back when he was like basically legally blind? I don't doubt any. These guys are nuts. You know, the season's on the line here. Future money's on the line here for Zach Moss. So it wouldn't surprise me that if there's any way he can play, that he does. That said, a broken shoulder's not exactly a good situation for a running back. Re-injuring that shoulder. One thing I learned last week, I didn't know who Terry Goodson was. And, I watch every snap of every game. The number of people that I don't know who they are that get the ball in the NFL is very, very small. What I learned last week is I think anyone can be pretty good in this Colts running attack. Don't have a ton of faith in either player as a talent, but good offensive line for the Colts. Surprisingly good offense. Again, I'd rather have White if he plays or Chandler, but if Moss misses, Sermon's, you could do worse than Sermon this week.
Ryan, you've been all over Shane Steichen and his coaching prowess this season for the Colts. Probably no team performing above expectation more than the Colts. And we're just going to stick with the Colts because Michael Pittman is concussed. Good chance he misses this week. Josh Downs, 51% rostered. Alec Pierce is only 3% rostered. We don't have too much interest in either, but one thing we talked about yesterday on our Monday recap show is that Alec Pierce seemed to be a little bit more the Michael Pittman replacement. Josh Downs, though, has the better target earning profile. I don't have too much faith in either. I think one of them probably gets there in fantasy. Do you have a lean on either? Since at this point, my fantasy rankings are going to hit the site this afternoon, and people will see that I just don't have particular faith in either right now.
Yeah, for a season-long league in Week 16, I'd rather not play either of them myself. I think they're more like volatile DFS options is how I'd treat them. And agreed, I mentioned this yesterday. The first pass that after Pittman went out, Pierce was in the X role. It was like a quick slant that was basically like, the kind of stuff that Pierce sees all the time. Or that Pittman sees rather. So Pierce is going to see that role. I think Downs is probably a little bit better of a player, but like you said, I'm not ultra confident in either of them.
Last, we'll hit on Josh Palmer, Chargers receiver, who's 30% rostered. We'll see if Keenan Allen plays this week. They face the Bills. Josh Palmer just had 4 catches, 113 yards, and a touchdown against the Raiders. And you might be like, well, you should have talked about him earlier in the show. The big problem was 79 of those yards and a touchdown was just gift wrapped to him. The Raiders were up by 50 points. It was a broken play. You take out this one broken play, and Josh Palmer literally didn't do anything. The 4 targets were a 13% target share. I don't expect the Bills to make the kind of mental mistakes that the Raiders made. I'd say right now, after the Niners, Ryan, would you say the last few weeks the Bills have played better than every team not named the Niners? Since that's kind of how I'm starting to look at it, and I just don't want to play Chargers auxiliary options given this offense and given the Bills.
That's a great question because I just did power rankings last night. The 49ers are my locked-in number 1 team for a long time now. I have Buffalo at 5, and that's probably aggressive versus the field. And I strongly considered putting Buffalo 3rd. So my answer to that question is yes right now.
All right, we got through the top ads. Ryan, I'm going to kick it over to you. We're going to talk about some start-sit decisions for Week 16. And remember, my fantasy rankings hit the site, the3013.com, later today.
Yeah, we're also co-authoring a start-sit piece starting this week. I think, does that come out Wednesday, Josh? Thursday?
Yeah, that'll drop Wednesday on the site.
And then, a few things you have on there. start Chuba Hubbard against the Packers. Why are you enthusiastic considering the Panthers' offense is maybe the most unwatchable unit in the league?
Yeah, we've talked about the Panthers passing attack at length. They've been under 200 passing yards in 7 straight games. They have 2 total passing touchdowns over the past 7. Fortunately, the run game is hyper consolidated. It's the Chuba Hubbard show. He has at least 22 carries in all 3 games now since head coach Frank Reich was fired. Sanders never hit 20 carries in any game this year. When you adjust for schedule and opponents, the Packers allow 2 more fantasy points per game to running back rooms than expected. That's the 9th best mark. Overall, the Packers allow 105 rushing yards per game, which is 4th most to running backs. So I like Chuba as a volume bet in one of the best matchups this week.
I mentioned yesterday I'm a Giants fan. The Eagles have now lost 3 in a row. It's going to be ugly for me on Christmas. My sister's family's all Eagle fans. It's going to be a very long day. You have Saquon Barkley at running back 27 against the Eagles. I think this is a good conversation, so I'm very curious to see where you're at here.
So let's look at the 7 games since Tommy DeVito took over. So we've got week 9, the Raiders, 8th best matchup for running back. Saquon has 14 fantasy points. Nice work, Saquon. Week 10, Cowboys, tough matchup. He only has 7 fantasy points. Week 11, the Commanders allow fantasy points to everyone. He has 30 fantasy points. Congrats, Saquon. Week 12 against the Patriots, extremely tough matchup against running backs. He has 6 fantasy points. Week 13, the Packers. We just talked about how the Packers are an easy matchup for running backs. He has 23 fantasy points. Last week against the Saints, that is a tough matchup again. He has under 6 fantasy points. This week against the Eagles, they are the toughest matchup for fantasy running backs when you adjust for schedule. Essentially, Saquon had 14, 30, and 23 fantasy points against top 9 opponents. And then anytime it was a tough matchup, he had 7, 6, 5.5 fantasy points. This is often what you see from running backs on terrible offenses where they are very, very opponent specific in fantasy football. Saquon just doesn't have much of a receiving role either. He had 4 catches, 57 yards, 2 touchdowns through the air against the Commanders. Folks, that's the Commanders. These other games, he has averaged 3 targets, 2 catches, 12 receiving yards a game. That is 3 fantasy points per game from receiving. There was really not that much of a receiving role here. DeVito might even be in concussion protocol. It might be Tyrod Taylor. I'm not quite sure what's going on there. Either way, I just want to bet against this Giants offense when, like you said, the Eagles, they lost 3 straight. They're hungry, they're motivated, and I think they're about to stomp the Giants.
That's J. Larky tweets. I love all that. I think Saquon has one path here, and it's extraordinarily thin. He has to break a run. And the one thing, if he gets there at all, and I'm talking like if he hits 14 fantasy points, it's because he sees 10 targets. Because Tommy DeVito took 7 sacks against the Saints last week. He might take a sack on every play against angry Philadelphia. So maybe some checkdowns, maybe some screen passes. But I'm with you. He's been disappointing all year, and yeah, this is a bad matchup. I love that, Josh. Now let's move on to wide receivers. I'm going to ask you a start. I'm going to ask you a sit here. You have Calvin Ridley against the Bucs as a start. What are we thinking here, pal?
Yeah, so Zay Jones now is week to week with a hamstring injury. He shouldn't play. Christian Kirk is on injured reserve. The Buccaneers are the 3rd best matchup for fantasy wide receivers. Fantasy receiver rooms average more than 6 fantasy points per game above expectation. Christian Kirk exited week 13 after only 1 route run. Week 13, Ridley had 8 targets, 156 air yards. Week 14, 13 targets, 166 air yards. Week 15, 12 targets, 164 air yards. During that 3-game span, he's had 8 red zone targets, with 5 of them coming in the end zone. Yet, Ryan, he's been under 10 fantasy points every game. I think positive regression hits Calvin Ridley like a freight train in the best way possible at week 16. We are going to confidently start him. I have him as a top 20 option this week.
I'm going to play him in DFS, so I love that. That's good news for me. Jordan Addison, Josh, you have him as a sit against the Lions. Where's your head at here?
Yeah, we have to have some spicy takes. Everyone will be plugging and playing Jordan Addison. And let's dive into why. So the week 13 bye hit. And then week 14, he had 3 targets. That was a 9% target share. He caught 2 passes for 27 yards. That doesn't sound very good. But then week 15, the reason everyone wants to start him, he had 6 catches for 111 yards and 2 touchdowns. The negatives, He only had 6 targets. That was third on the team behind Jefferson and Hawkinson. And he only had 53 air yards after having 22 air yards the week before. He is not getting many targets. He is not getting them deep down the field. When I rewatched the week 15 game against the Bengals, he benefited from 2 coverage breakdowns by the Bengals. Are we really trying to start the 4th option in a Nick Mullins offense when we know Justin Jefferson, TJ Hawkinson, and Ty Chandler are going to be much more involved? When we know that Jordan Addison hasn't run very far downfield for his routes and he hasn't gotten heavy target volume, do not chase the stat line from last week. Instead, go against the grain. Sit Jordan Addison, and I think you'll thank us later. Ryan, you're on the hot seat now. A couple questions for you for fantasy football.
Okay.
So I'm wondering if you set your fantasy lineups in isolation or if you take into account what your opponent's doing. I'll give you an example. So last week, someone asked me if they should start Matthew Stafford since their opponent had Kyren Williams and Puka Nacua. And I said, yes, you should start Stafford. I don't hate the game theory there, but also I just think Stafford can have a good game against the Commanders. Here's a tougher one. So this week, what if your opponent is starting Jahmyr Gibbs and Amon-Ra St. Brown? Jared Goff's kind of a fringe quarterback 1 in fantasy. Should you be starting someone like Goff as a game theory component? How are you thinking about the angles here?
Oh, this is good stuff. First, let me talk about last week because we talked about that matchup a lot. I would have done it. We actually did it in a tournament. We played Stafford and Kyren Williams, and I forget the name of it, but how I would have seen that is we'd like the Rams to exceed expectations. We'd like them to beat their team total. And by playing Kyren Williams and Stafford, we're getting basically all of the touchdown equity in that situation. And there's the chance for Stafford to throw a touchdown pass to Williams where we can double up. So in season long, in that kind of matchup where it's a smash spot, I'm in that. And like if you're on the other side where you're playing Stafford to kind of hedge between Puka and Williams, depends. If are you going to lose, that's my bigger thing. Like, are you planning on playing, or do you plan to win? Meaning, like, you look at your matchup, like, I got the edge here. If you're playing from behind, I'm less likely to hedge because I want to benefit if they fail. With this matchup against the Vikings, I think we've seen with Detroit's running game that like Goff can have. The thing that I find interesting about this too is like Amon-Ra St. Brown could have 7 catches for 110 yards and a touchdown, and Goff could have 220 yards and 2 touchdowns. So. And then Gibbs, the Lions have such an excellent running game. I'm less likely. I definitely wouldn't do it, by like a matter of this is what I'm doing every time as a game plan. But if I think I'm strong everywhere else and I'm worried about Amon-Ra St. Brown and maybe Gibbs, killing him in the passing game, I'd play Goff as a hedge in that situation. But if I think I'm playing from behind, I'm definitely going in a different direction.
All really, really good stuff. One more for you. Which capable offense are you most worried about struggling this weekend? Because some people out there, they're worried about the fantasy floors of an offense and its components with the quarterback and the skill players. I think your answer might surprise some people.
That's a good question too. I'm going to give you 2 if you don't mind. Are you good with that?
Yeah, we can bend the rules just a little bit.
Okay, right. I was trying to be respectful, Josh. I'm definitely worried about Baltimore in this matchup because, one, we saw Jacksonville's pass rush be pretty effective against Baltimore. The 49ers pass rush is an entirely different animal, and they're going to be at home. So, Zay Flowers is a good player. Odell Beckham's fine. The Ravens aren't exactly loaded with premium skill position players that could create a ton of separation against the 49ers. And while San Francisco's a good enough defense where they probably just do what they do more often than like opponent-specific game planning, I could see them being much more worried about Lamar Jackson running and like basically saying, beat us over the top, dude. So you have to play Jackson. To talk about a matchup years ago, Jackson's MVP, or he played Belichick's Patriots. And what I would do against Jackson is I'd blitz him in his face, blitz him from his right side, so he has to react and move left because he's not as good of a passer when he's moving left. And he made 4 or 5 plays in that game where I think that's the best game he ever played in his career. So even when people do the right things, he can still succeed, and he still has a huge ceiling. So I wouldn't sit him, but I'd be concerned about the floor. And second, Dallas just got rocked in Buffalo. They're in a correction spot against Miami, especially if Tyreek Hill misses this contest where Dan Quinn can over game plan for Jalen Waddle. The Cowboys pass rush is due for a spike game. Miami has a ton of offensive line injuries, and we've seen if you disrupt their timing, that offense kind of struggles. On the other hand, I think Mike McDaniel might lean on the run more since beating the Cowboys defenses, the teams that ran the ball well have had the most success. So those are both on my radar. I could see them both underwhelming.
Guys, that's Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. Make sure you're checking out his work on the33team.com. The man has watched every snap of every game since 2014 and still lives to tell about it.
So far.
And also, we welcome all comments, positive and negative, on Twitter and YouTube. I just want to give a shout out to Dave Semenza on Twitter. He commented, "You are a huge loser with those shades. Dave, you need to be more specific. We both have shades. We need to know who you are talking about. If you're going to troll us, at least make it specific."
Yeah, at least make it entertaining. Like a loser, like thanks, dude. Like Mr. Originality over here.
Yeah, Ryan and I feel pretty great this morning. We feel like winners. We want to help you be winners. Let's talk about some quarterback streamers that might get you over the top. I really like Baker Mayfield this week against the Jaguars. I talked about how I liked Calvin Ridley. And then on the other end of this game, I also like Baker Mayfield. It's two defenses that are of the pass funnel variety. That often leads to some fantasy points. The Jaguars are the 5th best matchup for fantasy quarterbacks when you adjust for schedule. Baker Mayfield has at least 16 fantasy points, 7 of his past 9 games. The 2 misses were the Niners and the Panthers during that span. Both of them are bottom 4 fantasy matchups for quarterbacks. Ryan, we talked yesterday, Baker might get extended by the Buccaneers. He's starting to hit his stride this year. Are you confident in him as a low-end fantasy quarterback one against the Jaguars? Because it is a rough slate for fantasy quarterbacks this week.
Confident? No. Does he belong there? Yes, especially against this team. So, like you said, it's a rough stretch with streamers. There's so many backup quarterbacks on this list that we're going to have here. I think he's the best option, and I'm not even sure it's close.
All right, we're going to start to dumpster dive. We got 2 more options. Nick Mullins hosts the Lions. Vikings quarterback completed 79% of his passes, 303 yards, threw 2 touchdowns, threw 2 picks. He's surrounded overall by a strong offensive line and great weapons. Lions are the 4th best matchup for fantasy quarterbacks. That's all great. That's positive. At the end of the day, he's just a streamer. What should the concerns be with someone like Mullins for this matchup?
He's not that good. His weapons are great. Coaching staff's good. The thing is he's Nick Mullins, and not to be, the thing with, I feel bad saying these kind of things because, like, if you're in the NFL, you're awesome, but compared to the other players in the NFL, Nick Mullins is a below average backup quarterback. So that's your concern here. That said, though, Josh, the Lions have been smoked by people, and you got Justin Jefferson, you got TJ Hawkinson. There's upside here. There is.
Then Joe Flacco, I think he's kind of in that Nick Mullins tier. He travels to Houston to face the Texans. Texans are the 6th best match for fantasy quarterbacks when you adjust for schedule. Quarterbacks have averaged just over 2 fantasy points above their season-long average against the Texans. Flacco now has at least 250 passing yards and multiple passing touchdowns in all 3 starts. That is at least 17 fantasy points in every game. And Ryan, we talked about this on our show yesterday. They're letting him let it rip. At least 44 pass attempts all 3 games. They were never letting Deshaun Watson, PJ Walker, Dorian Thompson-Robinson do that. Talk a little bit more about how you see this game playing out, because yesterday, quote, you said that this is one of the sneakiest, most interesting games of Week 16.
It is. I mean, huge playoff ramifications. The Texans winning last week with Case Keenum, like they have a really good chance to get in now, maybe with a win in game in Week 18 against the Colts. Like you said, Flacco volume is huge here. The Texans offense is better today than it was early in the season, so I could see this being a tough matchup, especially with the Browns' offensive line injuries. I like Mullins and Mayfield more than Flacco, but for NFL purposes, I think Flacco's basically saved the Browns season.
That's kind of how I see it as well. My fantasy rankings hit the site later today, folks, and you will see where I have Mayfield, Mullins, and Flacco ranked, and they are ranked in that order. Tight end streamers. Darren Waller, he's only 63% rostered. So he's probably out on waivers in your league, or whoever has them. If it's you probably have another option as well to consider. The Giants travel to face the Eagles. In his return from injury this past week, 6 targets, 4 catches, 40 yards. That's good, not great. But the Eagles, to begin with, that's an above average matchup for fantasy tight ends. Ryan, as you mentioned, they're going to sack the living heck out of Tommy DeVito. They're going to create a lot of pressure. Waller works close to the line of scrimmage. And I think if you're in a PPR or tight end premium league, Waller is a a fringe fantasy tight end one this week.
This is the best way I can explain this to you, Josh. I'm in a $500 entry league I have where I had a buy, and I'm going into this week where I have Dallas Goedert, Dalton Kincaid, Trey McBride at tight end. I tried grabbing Waller as the fourth tight end in my team 2 weeks ago to block him down the stretch, to block any opponent I have from him. So if you're in dire straits and he's available, the Giants are going to have to throw against these guys, and Waller is a dynamic player at the tight end position.
I like that you mentioned Trey McBride. I moved him to tight end 1 this week. Those rankings hit the site soon. He has usurped Travis Kelce. We simply cannot deny the volume McBride's getting, and there's numerous injuries to that Cardinals receiving core as well. All right, we'll mention one more tight end streamer. This guy's only 24% rostered. He should be available in your league. It's Hunter Henry at the Denver Broncos. Bailey Zappi's been a little bit better than expected. Henry has 19 fantasy points back-to-back weeks with Zappy. He's coming off a season-high 9 targets. He's had 1 end zone target each of the past 2 games, so the touchdown upside's real. And tight ends against the Broncos have averaged, as a unit, 3.5 fantasy points above expectation. That's the second best mark. It's a small sample. Anytime we're looking at fantasy tight end stats and matchups and fantasy points allowed, but Henry's a decently talented player. He's available everywhere, and Bailey Zappi's not terrible. Anything else to add here?
Yeah. Like 2 months ago, I talked about this with Jordan. Vance Joseph's defenses struggle against tight ends. To go back to quarterback real quick, first, if any of these quarterbacks are in Jordan Vanek's player pool, you should plug him in. That's the guy you should take. If Hunter Henry's in his player pool, which I expect he will be, he's, if he's still available in your league, like he shouldn't be, and he's a way you can make margin this week, I think.
I like that. Ryan, let's hit your bread and butter defense, special team streamers. Ryan's top 12 defense rankings are always in my fantasy rankings. They hit the site, the33rdteam.com later this afternoon. Packers defense, 48% rostered at Carolina. What do you want to talk about here other than Panthers offense? Terrible.
Same $500 entry team. I've had Dallas as my defense all year. I actually picked up Green Bay 2 weeks ago to play in this matchup. Less confident after last week's debacle against Baker Mayfield's Bucks, where they got shredded, but Packers are still technically alive in the NFC. Panthers have the worst offense in the league. Packers should have a pass rush advantage. Big upside here.
Another one I like, and it seems like you like it as well since I glanced at your rankings, the Bears defense against the Cardinals. They're only 15% rostered. Cardinals have a lot of receiver injuries. Bears defense is playing out of their mind. What do you like here?
Yeah, I'd say over the last 2 months, the Bears have a top 10 defense. That's how I'd frame that. Arizona, they'll have a bit of a line play advantage, the Bears. And if they play with a lead here, like you said, Kyler Murray's a great player, but outside of Trey McBride, no one's really doing a whole lot. So I think this game has some interesting shootout potential, but if there were multiple turnovers and a handful of sacks here, it wouldn't really surprise me all that much.
Broncos defense hosts the Patriots. They're 48% rostered. Good chance they're available in your league. Why should we like the Broncos?
I like correction spots in a lot of situations where that does not apply to every team after a loss, but Denver's won, I think, 6 of their last 8 games. They got blown out in Detroit last week. The Patriots' offense is an entirely different animal than the Lions. Denver's defense is in a spot to get the ship right here, so I like them against Bailey Zapp here.
I like that. Ryan, I was surprised to see just how high you had the Texans defense against the Browns this week. Texans are available in most leagues. Talk to me about why you are incredibly aggressive with your ranking on them this week.
Yeah, Browns offensive line injuries. Joe Flacco's a statuesque quarterback, and D'Amico Ryans is actually like an excellent defensive line. So Flacco had, I think, 3 interceptions and took 4 sacks last week. Not exactly expecting that same kind of ceiling, but, multiple sacks, a couple turnovers is very much on the table for the Texans defense.
We've got 2 more, folks. Bengals defense. They are traveling to Pittsburgh. Terrible towels will be out in effect. Fortunately, Mason Rudolph draws the start. I assume that is the thesis of this play.
Yeah. I view this as a coin flip play, so I'm not really super enthusiastic about the Bengals. I could see the Steelers beating them like 13-10. So, ugly game plans on the table here. But like you said, if Cincinnati plays with any kind of lead, I'm interested in betting against Mason Rudolph.
Finally, the Colts defense. They've been overperforming all year in the fantasy points department. They traveled to Atlanta. We talked yesterday about how Desmond Ridder threw one of the most head-scratching interceptions of the season. Tyler Algier got all the touches last week. None of the big three have done much throughout this season. What else do you want to add here?
Yeah, we'll do start sits in Discord this week, and this is a situation where if you have the Colts defense versus another matchup, like, ask me, we'll talk about it. Colts defense has been a very high performer in fantasy. I don't really view them as a great defense, just an overachieving one. That said, Atlanta's a mess. I have no confidence in them. I'm interested in betting against Desmond Ridder. I'm not going to have them in the top 12 Indianapolis, but they're on the bubble.
Folks, we just went over the top waiver wire ads of the week, some fantasy start sits, some fantasy football game theory, quarterback, tight end, defensive streamers in 30 minutes flat. I'm Josh Larky. He's Ryan Reynolds. We work for the 33rd team. Thank you, everyone.